Hello, my friends. This is Lynda Lippin, and welcome to the Pilates Goddess podcast. Well, hello, everybody. It's Lynda, your host of the Pilates Goddess podcast, and welcome back. You came back once again to listen to the podcast, and I am really excited about today's guest. In several of the interviews that I've done over the past few months, I have spoken a little bit about my own experience with weight, my own experience with diet culture, my own experience in the fitness and Pilates industry, which I've been in for, over 34 years now. And during my time in teaching Pilates, I have been every weight from about probably 130 to 210. And I usually settle in around between 160 and 180. And that tends to be my place where I sit. But I have a lot to say, and I know my guest today does as well, about diet culture, about skinny culture, about control of women, and ways that we can kind of help ourselves get out of that. Okay, so my guest today is coming to us from the other side of the pond. Her name is Hayley Perkins, and she has been a therapist now. We were just discussing this for 19 years, for close to 20 years. Hayley started out as an insurance project analyst and project manager, and then realized in her own therapy that she was miserable and that is not what she wanted to do. And so she forged her own path, which was probably not the path your parents were that thrilled about, but worked out in the end, and is now a specialist in helping women dig deeper into why diets don't work long term and to explore what can work for them in terms of health and weight loss. She is the author of a book, If Diets Don't Work, Then What Does? A daily food and mood journal to kickstart you on the path to a healthy relationship with food, which is a 60-day tracker and available on Amazon. And of course, I will put a link in the show notes. Hayley is also all over social media. She has a fabulous free Facebook group that I am a part of. And of course, links to everything will be on the site and will be in all of the show notes. So Hayley, welcome.
Oh, you're welcome. What a fabulous introduction. You've done your homework. I love it. Just as you say that, being a therapist for 20 years, I mean, I'm 51 now, so I may only look in my 30s. So people probably think I've been that since I left school, but I haven't. And, that was a real pivotal point for me. And I think when I start looking at the work that I do with my clients, how many of those are living their lives so unaligned to what really makes them happy. So that was a really fundamental part in my own journey, realizing actually my career had been very much driven by the need to please my parents. And so part of my therapy was, actually finding a career that was aligned to what made me truly happy. And in doing so, that was a massive part of the jigsaw of me sorting out my own disordered eating. I've had a bit like yourself, I've got that. I've been 10 stone, I've been 19 stone and every number in between, and have settled. I'm a healthy weight for me is actually around 12 stone. Sorry, I'm talking in stones. I know that may not be translatable. Technically, if I went to a doctor's, they'd say I was overweight. And this is the battle that we have a lot of the time. But I know once I drop below that, it becomes a battle for me. So part of my transition away from diet culture has been starting to accept that my body actually settles at a weight that's higher than the weight that I've told myself for years, or that diet culture has told myself for years I need to be. So yeah, it's lovely to be here. And I'm really looking forward to answering some of your questions and offering I try not to be, I am anti-diet culture, because I see every single day the harm that it does in our society, but I'm not anti-weight loss, and hopefully, we can talk a little bit about that.
Right.
if we are overweight, and that can have implications, not just health implications, but also I feel better when I'm slimmer. I prefer the clothes that I wear, but it's where diet culture sort of pushes the point that you need to be slim to be healthy, and that absolutely isn't true. And we were talking earlier, and I think actually the pressure we put on ourselves to be thinner is far more dangerous a lot of the time than the weight itself, and I think that gets missed a lot of the time.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I've read, some of your backstory as well. And I had, I think, a similar situation growing up where my mother was overweight. My mother was bipolar. And, a lot of the medications that she took kind of led to weight gain. But she needed a friend to diet with. And so she started taking me to her meetings, whether it was Weight Watchers, which had, started, whether it was Overeaters Anonymous, whatever it was, whether she was going to the Atkins diet doctor, whatever, she would take me.
Yeah.
And everyone would pretend like I was overweight and needed to be there. They would weigh me in, they would give me the diet thing, I would sit through the meetings. And I thought, I guess, because what else was I supposed to think, that this was, a legitimate way of eating. And this was the original Weight Watchers where, breakfast was a half a cup of low-fat cottage cheese with a couple of pieces of Melba toast.
Yeah, and
a glass of orange juice. It was not.
No, what we're exposed to in childhood, and this is such an important part that I explore with my clients. And it's not about blaming our parents, but it is about understanding the impact that those early years have had on us.
Right.
Very similar to you, my mum and my nan were constantly dieting. I thought it was normal to get on the scales and to have a negative reaction to that. Everything was about how they looked, what they were eating. And sadly, that got translated down to me. I was around that kind of diet culture and diet conversations. When you're very little, you're really impressionable, and that stuff becomes part of our normal, doesn't it? So
it does. When I was 12 years old, I was eating 600 calories a day.
Wow.
Yeah. I worked it all out on paper. I mean, I just thought, well, if this number of calories is good, then even less than that should be better.
Yeah. And, if the strong female role models in our lives, certainly my mum and my nan, and if they didn't like their bodies, that's naturally going to transcend to me, and so by the age of 12, already being obsessed with those numbers, that's really scary, isn't it, Lynda? And no one there to show you otherwise.
Right. And it's only when now I look at photos, because I think, I thought that I was overweight all of that time, right, when I wasn't. So then when I did go through my own medical stuff with endometriosis and hormonal treatments and all of that, and I did gain weight, I didn't even see it while it was happening. And now I need to look at photos of myself to see what size I am, because I cannot tell just from looking at myself or being in my own body. I have a lot of dysmorphia around that. And so many of my clients do as well. And I think this is kind of what scares me in a way, is that I've had clients get gout from going keto, right? I've had clients freaking out because they were doing strict paleo, as if we actually really know everything they were eating then. And it involved, little balls of stuff packed in a plastic bag, which is half of the paleo snacks that I see out there.
Irony, eh?
Right. So, we've seen Atkins, we've seen intermittent fasting, we've seen Weight Watchers, we've seen, Jenny Craig, all of the supplement companies, all of the multi-level marketing companies, Beachbody, that are just making money off of off of convincing people that they need to buy, $100 shakes.
The whole dieting industry is completely about making money out of people's misery and shame and guilt, and it's, oh God, it is, absolutely, and I think we're going through a bit of a phase where they're packaging diets up in a way that kind of are sneaky and appear to be healthy eating plans. Ultimately, the only diet that's ever going to work for us is the one we've created ourselves, the one that actually is aligned with how we want, that works for us. It's really interesting when we look at some of things like fasting and stuff, and there will be an element of success for some people when they do it. For how long? Some people will be successful and they'll lose weight and they'll keep it off. Other people who have more of an emotional attachment to food, who have body image stuff going on, it's unlikely to be a long-term solution for them. So things like fasting that encourage us to eat in a way that we did when we were cavemen, is crackers, because what we're doing is we're basically saying, create a fasting environment, but in a world where there is an abundance of food. And so we're constantly putting ourselves in a position where we're fighting with our bodies, because let's face it, not eating the foods that you want to eat is really hard work and it requires willpower. And this is where we start to fall down, because this is where our conscious mind and our unconscious mind starts to fight itself, because the conscious mind goes, oh, I need to lose weight. I know what, I'm going to try this new diet that's come out on the market. I'll be able to stick to it this time. And so we go forward with excitement and anticipation and the belief that this might be, or the hope that this might be the next thing that works for us. And of course, depending on what we've got going on in our unconscious mind, we start following the rules, and then it's not long before actually those rules don't work for us. So that's when it starts to unravel, and we use terms like fall off the wagon or whatever. And of course, instead of actually stepping back and looking at why it's not working for us, we go into yet another cycle of guilt and shame and blame and that sense of failure. So I'm a big believer that diets actually are part of the problem. They're not part of the solution. But when you're working with somebody who's so desperate to lose weight for whatever reason, normally because they maybe have got stuff going on in their relationships and they believe if they're slimmer, we do like to buy into this belief that we'll be happier when we're slimmer.
Right.
I think if you've lost weight, there is a degree of that's true. We certainly maybe feel better in our clothes. We might be able to move a bit more. We comply with what society says is okay. So when we look at, as humans, we need that sense of belonging. When we lose weight, we kind of feel like we fit in a little bit more. We're not quite so unapproved of, if you like. So, there's so much of that stuff that's intrinsically linked into why, when we're working with clients, they're so desperate to lose weight. So you can see, if we carry on believing that weight's the problem, we're constantly going to look at the losing weight is obviously the solution. But for many of us, it's much broader than that. Our weight is really complex. It's not just a physical thing, it's an emotional thing. And just the parts of your story you've shared there, Lynda, about your experiences growing up, they are so fundamental. And it's not just about food and weight. It's around our general experiences growing up, the attachments that we have with our parents. My mum and dad worked. My mum and dad, I had a fairly stable upbringing. I was born in the 70s. I was born in a time where if I cried as a baby, my mum would put me at the bottom of the garden and let me cry. That was like
right.
School here in the UK. I think there was a lady called Gina Ford or something, and she was very much like, if your baby cries, don't go to her at any cost. And so I grew up where I was put at the bottom of the garden. So 6 weeks old, my mum didn't come to me when I cried. So, when we start to explore how that has an impact on our attachment style, that I learned not to cry. I learned to not ask for my needs to be met.
Right.
So,
because you were like, why bother? Because no one's going to come deal with it anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, when we start to actually look at, what's the solution going forward? Of course, if there is extra weight and there is a desire or a need to lose that weight, then absolutely, look at ways that work, that are not overly restrictive, that will help with that. But it's not just an eat less and exercise thing. It's so much broader than that, because if not, all we're going to do is keep sabotaging our attempts each time. If we don't look beneath the what we're eating and start to explore why we're eating, those cycles are going to keep going round and round and round, and it's complex. And I can totally understand why a lot of people don't want to take a peek behind the curtain, because that's hard.
It is hard. And I remember reading a post of yours several months ago where you were like, I ate a sandwich today. I ate a sandwich and I didn't feel guilty about it. Absolutely. And I didn't look at it and question the bread and wonder, we all have these things, right? I'm assuming you have some of the same ones where you're like, maybe I should just have one slice of bread.
Yeah.
And it should be an open face sandwich, right? Or or maybe I should get the ultra thin sliced bread, right? Like we go through this whole thing. And then I'm like, it's just bread.
I know. It's just, and I have a huge awareness of this stuff because I've been working on myself. I've been overweight all of my life, Lynda. My mum put me on my first diet when I was 14, but it started way before then. I was sneaking food and eating food from about the age of 6, I think. I've done a lot of work on sort of tracking that. I did like a timeline of my weight and associated with what was going on at times in my life. And it was really powerful to do that. So 14, I was put on my first diet. A real key point for me in 1997, I left a really dysfunctional relationship, and I left that relationship a size 24. I think that would be a 28 in the US. I was 19 stone. And I had gone into that relationship 6 years earlier, the size I am now, a size 12, 14, and come out of it. I'd gained about 8 stone in a 7-year window because it was a really horrible relationship. And I didn't know how to express that. I kept things really secret. I was embarrassed to share what I was going through, and that presented in my weight. So I've had, when I look at the ups and downs of my weight, it really has been erratic. Now, I came out of that relationship thinking it was my fault, that it was because of my weight that he treated me that way. So, of course, naturally, I wanted to shift the weight. And so I spent 5 years doing exactly that, trying every yo-yo dieting, losing 2 stone, gaining 1, losing 3 stone, gaining 2. And that cycle just went on until finally I got there. I pulled on that magical size 10 pair of jeans. And that was very short-lived, because actually what I experienced, the story I had created where I'd be so happy when I finally lost the weight, men would find me attractive, I'd be acceptable, I'd be able to wear the clothes I wanted to wear. And whilst elements of that were true, what actually happened for me was all of my insecurities, all of my anxious attachment, started to come flooding in, far worse than when I was bigger. And that's what took me into therapy for the first time, because I realized that actually this wasn't about willpower or greed or anything like that. There was something more significant going on for me. And it was through therapy that I actually started to understand my weight was my armor. It was a protection. As crazy as that sounds, my weight, or somewhere in my subconscious brain that's aged at about 6, I think, made a decision that if I was fat, if I was overweight, men would find me unattractive. Therefore, I wouldn't need to have a relationship. Therefore, they couldn't hurt me. Makes total sense, doesn't it?
It but does, actually.
Absolutely. And, that was just like the first time ever I'd started to actually consider that my weight was not about being lazy or greedy or lacking willpower. There was a lot more to it. And that became like a foundation from which I started to build. I started to then, because my conscious mind and unconscious mind was just fighting itself. My conscious was saying, oh, I'm not accepted at this size. I need to lose weight. And I was constantly dieting. My unconscious was going, oh, no chance, that's not happening. I need to stay this weight to be safe. And so this is how we start to butt horns, and we start to create this conflict. And people say it's self-sabotage and stuff like that. But actually my unconscious was doing a very, very good job at keeping me safe. And of course, I've had to work through that to start to understand actually that I was very young when I made that decision that you can't trust men. And I've had to work on updating that belief in order to then be able to feel safe to live in a slimmer body, and I work with lots of clients, and some people present that similar reason for holding on to weight. But that's a question I'll often ask my clients when I first start working with them. I'll say, how is your weight serving you? And they often look at me pretty gone out and go, well, it's not, I just want to lose it. But a case, there's often reasons why we're holding on to extra weight. And for a lot of people, it is protect.
Yes. And then, it's interesting as well, because socially, what we've also done in terms of food and the kind of food that we have around us, right, is we sweeten it. We add stuff to it. Like here in the US, everything's got sugar in it. Like you name it, you pick it up. There's some form of sugar in it, unless it's like meat. They even label meat like no carbs, no sugar sometimes. And I'm like, of course there's no carb because it's meat. But, you feel sometimes like even if you're trying to cut things out, it's hard to cut things out because the stuff is always omnipresent. And that also then made me realize that it's not necessarily the stuff that's in the food, that it's not necessarily just the extra sugars that were added or whatever else, that's really not the issue. And let's face it, I mean, I know as a coach, like willpower, willpower is doing shit you hate. It's forcing yourself to do stuff you hate.
And that works against how our brains are set up. We're designed to seek pleasure and avoid pain. And whilst we try to elude that cutting out all the foods we really want to eat is pleasurable, it really isn't. And so we're kind of really setting ourselves up from the start. And, there's absolutely, the way in which our food is produced nowadays. I'm not a nutritionist, so I don't tend to cover too much of that stuff off. But the way in which our food is produced and the level of nutrition that's in it has changed massively over the last sort of 20 or 30 years. So even with good intentions, when we think we're eating fairly healthily, we just don't know. So you have got, the whole kind of nutrition side of things. But for me, I think the thing is what diet culture really teaches us is it teaches us the good and bad food list, doesn't it? The food rules. And I think that's one of the strongest food rules. We're all guilty of having the good food list that often contains chicken and lettuce and all of that stuff, and then the bad food list which has the cakes and the crisps and the chocolate and all of that on it. And of course what we do is we attach a moral status to it, don't we? So when we eat those foods, we feel bad for eating them. And so that's what drives, it's a bit like a pendulum, really. We go from restriction. And the thing about restriction is it makes us feel safe. It's the rule book, isn't it? Which is why diets make us feel safe, because that somebody gives us the rule book. And if we follow the rule book, like a good girl, we're going to achieve the results. But of course, it's hard to follow someone else's rules. And so what we do is we do the restriction. But quite often that is like sending a 5-year-old to a birthday party and telling them they're not allowed to eat any of the party food. It's really hard to live in a world of restriction when there's so much of an abundance around us. And so eventually, whether it's a day later, a week later, 3 weeks later, we are going to indulge in those foods. And then that kicks off the guilt and shame cycle, and we feel so bad. And then we're trying to claw our way back into that world of rigidity and restriction again. And so that pendulum just constantly goes from one side to the other. And what we're doing every single time is we are reinforcing a lack of trust in ourselves, a lack of trust that we can attune to our natural hunger and eat when we want to eat and stop eating when we are full. Diet culture, one of the biggest things is it breaks that attunement. When we're babies, we know when we're hungry and we know when we're full. No amount of trying to overfeed a baby is it going to happen. But then we start to get conditioned, don't we? We have to eat by the clock, and we're told that we've got to eat everything on our plate, and so
that's the thing. First they tell us we have to eat everything on the plate, and then they're like, but you're eating too much.
Absolutely. I very much, that was my mum's parenting style. She would bake and
Yes.
cook loads of lovely cakes. And then if we ate them, she'd call us little piggies for eating it. But then it's so fascinating. And when we can explore this stuff with curiosity and open-heartedness, because that's so important, and not judgments and stuff, there's so much information there that actually, we start to really see why we have this distorted, disordered relationship with food and our bodies and eating. So it's not just food, it's that relationship with our bodies, and it's our relationship with eating as well. I've been a prolific secret eater. I would do the typical, I'd go out and I'd order a salad and everyone would think, oh, look at you ordering your salad, but I'd have eaten before I went out, or I'd eat when I got in. So when we start to look at how are we reinforcing some of these really unhealthy patterns, it's a blueprint. It's quite often very crystal clear as to how diet culture has taught us to be embarrassed, to feel huge amounts of guilt and shame around eating a piece of cake. Hello, it's crackers,
Right.
isn't it? It's
right.
crackers.
Or they give us these weird lower calorie options that are never any good, right?
Yeah.
Like here, I think, I don't know if you had them there, but we had a whole line called Snackwells, and it was made by Nabisco, and it was the 100-calorie pack of fat-free and lower sugar versions of like Chips Ahoy or like the cookies that we really, really like. And they were never that good, and they were in these little packages, never. Or ice milk as opposed to ice cream, right?
We convince
no, it is
absolutely.
not.
Do you know what?
Good.
Do you know what, Lynda? If ever I did that, if ever I was like, I haven't dieted for years, but when I was in the world of dieting, I think, I really fancy a packet of crisps or something like that. And I'd go, no, don't have a crisp, go and have a bit of ham. So I'd go to the fridge and I'd have a bit of ham, and that hasn't really done it. And then I think, I'll have an apple. So I'd have an apple, and then I'd have the packet of crisps anyway. So it's like, and that's the same thing with these low calorie things, it's not scratching the itch. And so we're still wanting something. It is literally like saying to a kid that there's a big cake in front of them, but they can't have that. They've got to have an apple. It's like, it's just not going to work, and of course, this is what we do, isn't it? This is what we do with diets. And, the way we start to move away from this is actually realizing how we're setting ourselves up over and over again. I worked with a client recently. She was a prolific binge eater. She would have days and days of like not eating anything, and then she'd have days of binging. And we started to just explore some of the patterns that would trigger a binge for her. So talking about low calorie food, she would often go to Tesco's and she'd think, I really fancy a sandwich. And she'd look at all the sandwiches that are on offer and she'd go, I really fancy egg and bacon. But I can't have that. That's too many calories. Or what's the Weight Watchers offers? Okay, yeah, I'll have an egg and cress sandwich from Weight Watchers. And she'd buy her egg and cress Weight Watchers sandwich and she'd sit in the car and she'd eat it. It did nothing for her, and she'd get home and she'd eat a packet of biscuits, and she couldn't, and then she'd sort of beat herself up for doing that. And so we started to talk about this, and it was really interesting because at that point, instead of eating what she really wanted to eat, she was telling herself that she couldn't have that, because food isn't just about nutrition, it's about pleasure and it's about satisfaction. And if we're not getting pleasure and satisfaction from the food we're eating, we're going to be looking for something else. And there were so many ways that she was setting herself up to overeat by doing this restriction, this constant restriction. And so it's in little moments like that, it's in being able to identify patterns like that we're stuck in, that we can really start to see that we're not doing ourselves any favor. But yeah, God, there is nothing comes into this house now that's low fat or low sugar.
Right. Yeah, same here. I mean, if I want a potato, if I want a crisp, I want a slice of potato that's fried in oil and has salt on it, because that's the thing. If I want a chocolate chip cookie, I want a good chocolate chip cookie.
And enjoy it. Just a little experiment for anyone who's listening that can relate to this stuff. Something I get my clients doing. I get them to get a bit of paper and split it in half and put good foods one side, bad foods the other, and to write a list of good foods and then to write a list of their bad foods. And what I get them to do is a little experiment. So this is about desensitizing ourselves from exactly what we're talking about and starting to actually give ourselves permission to eat. But it needs to be done slowly, because if all of a sudden we just start eating all of those foods on our bad food list, it's going to overwhelm us. But this is about just starting to desensitize and teach ourselves that it's okay to eat these foods, that nothing bad is going to happen. And so choose one of the things off your bad food list and then create an environment where you're going to sit and you're going to eat it, but you're going to like portion it and you're going to put it on a plate and you're going to find where you want to sit and eat it in the house or in the car, wherever. And then you're going to say to yourself, I give myself unconditional permission to eat this food, because that starts to change the patterns that we've got in our brain. Then eat it, and eat it over 5 or 10 minutes and thoroughly enjoy it. Taste it, really enjoy it, and repeat that process every day. And it's amazing how quickly that kind of fear, because fear is behind a lot of this in terms of what we're eating. Sorry, just one second. I'm going to close the door because there's some noises coming from the kitchen. No. Fear is behind so much of this, and it's little experiments, because one of the things I have to do with clients is I have to start building their trust, in themselves, that they can start. Because the big belief is if you start giving yourself permission to eat anything, like no food is off limits, their belief is they're going to gain loads of weight. And because of this negative perception that we have got around weight, that's really scary, especially if they're already holding on to extra weight. So it's difficult, because the question I will often say to clients is, do you want to lose weight or do you want to sort out your food relationship? Of course, they want both a lot of the time, but actually one often comes before the other. And sometimes clients will see a bit of weight gain before they start to see the weight come off. And that needs to be navigated as well, because the solution, if you like, is unpicking diet culture. And that involves giving yourself permission to eat and eating for pleasure. And for anyone who's lived their life terrified of eating certain foods or being overweight, that can be really quite challenging, which is why it has to be done over time.
Right. I also think, as we're talking and I'm listening to you, I'm realizing that we treat, and this goes back to like Overeaters Anonymous, right? That we start to treat food as an addiction. Yeah. And we start to talk about it as being an addiction, right? Mm-hmm. And then we bring people into 12-step program for food. Now, I understand 12-step program for alcohol. Yeah. I understand 12-step programs for drug abuse, but 12-step programs for food positions food in the same category or positions eating too much in the same category as alcoholism and drug addiction. And while there still may be some of that obviously going on in the brain, in terms of comfort and in terms of serotonin and in terms of all of that, treating food in that way or framing it in that way makes things worse, doesn't it?
I think the fundamental difference between food and alcohol and cigarettes or drugs is that we have to have it to survive. Right. So it's not a language I use. I don't associate food with addiction. It's just not a connection that I make. I do think it's used as a coping mechanism, as are many things, of which alcohol and drugs are part of that. But in terms of it depends what the treatment. The biggest thing I think is we don't recognize overeating. When we look at eating disorders, we look at anorexia, we look at bulimia, we look at binge eating disorder and compulsive eating disorder. But there's a huge range of disordered eating in between that's not recognized as as a disorder of some kind. So I guess when we start thinking about treatment plans, if there is I'm not party to Overeaters Anonymous. It's not something I've really looked into. I know how our NHS support people who are very overweight, and it makes my toes curl. I've actually got 2 clients who have been through the program, and it's very heavily focused on losing weight. It's not focused on really helping them to understand what's at the very core of their eating. And so they've been given a place on a program that is very, very hard to get onto, which has obviously filled them with hope and expectation, only to be met with a nutritionist that's telling them if they don't drink milk for 12 weeks, they can't do the program, with a psychologist that's very much supporting that approach. So I'm guessing any treatment plan that follows an addiction route is going to look at an abstinence phase. So that, for me, is counterintuitive. Most of my clients who have been compulsive dieters actually feel safe in the restriction phase, but it doesn't teach them anything. So I think the approach when working with addictions is abstinence, and I don't think that is the correct approach when we're looking at food, because I think that just temporarily put someone in a position where they feel like they're in control, but ultimately they've got to learn to live in the world of food, and they've got to learn to manage, because even when you've worked through your own triggers and understanding as to why you overeat, unfortunately the world around you is still very driven by diet culture. And so at every opportunity there's an invitation to get pulled back into that. It's really difficult to protect yourself from social media and also friends and family, that encouraging you to eat, or to roll their eyes if you're saying, well, I don't want to eat that. A big change I've recently made in my eating plan was very much learning to eat when I'm physically hungry. And of course, I used to do the have breakfast, have lunch, and have a big meal in the evening. And I realized that doesn't actually work for me. I'm much more eating through the day and then having something very small in the evening. But also I like to cook, and also I do the cooking. So there was a part of me that worried, if I'm not eating a big meal in the evening, how will that impact my relationship with Gary? Because let's face it, cooking and eating is connection, isn't it? And so I have started to eat 4 times a day, but really small meals. So I'm never going more than 3 or 4 hours. And that has been revolutionary, honestly, Lynda. Such a small change, but we're conditioned, aren't we, to eat like these big meals. And so I now eat the same food. In fact, no food is off limits. I eat what I want. I just eat much smaller portions and 4 times a day. And then if I'm hungry, I will go and eat something. There's none of this battle anymore that, once I get past 7 o'clock at night, I can't eat any food, because that's what diets say. Some diets will say, don't eat past 7 o'clock, don't eat. But there's so many food rules out there. And actually, we've got to try and navigate away from them and actually start to create a plan that works for us. And however that looks.
And that even happened, inside of the fitness industry. If we then go into kind of exercise culture and that whole situation, where suddenly you're on your treadmill or you're on your, cardio machine, and it's telling you how many calories you burned.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Right?
I know. I can
during
remember
that workout.
I know.
And I remember, like, when they started doing that, I thought, why don't you just put a fucking candy machine, just attach it right here. And like the minute you hit however many calories that the Snickers bar is, or, the pack of hobnobs, like,
oh my God.
They just pop down and you just get off that machine and eat your candy, because that's essentially what it trained people to do. People would be so proud that they burned, 400 calories on their cardio machine that day. And I was like, number one, that machine has no idea how many calories you burned, because that depends on a whole host of factors.
Absolutely. And, the whole world of counting is it makes me judder a little bit, you know, counting calories, getting on and off the scales, Fitbits. And I get that they can be a good aid for some people. And again, you know, I'm very much about working with the individual and what works for them. And sometimes the scales and their Fitbits, they help them to feel safe. It gives them a level of control. And if you take all of that away, all of a sudden, it's like taking a dummy off a baby, isn't it? So we have to like gently go forward with some of this stuff and help people to understand that actually they don't need these aids. They can learn to trust themselves, actually get to reconnect with themselves. I think a lot of these tools, diets, the scales, things that kind of measure are aids that actually stop us trusting ourselves and stop us actually attuning to what we already know. You know, we started talking about, you know, babies know what to eat and when not to eat, but we're conditioned out of that. And so unfortunately, a lot of us are in a position where we have to start to uncondition ourselves. And that's much harder, isn't it? You know, it's almost like we've all got to plug ourselves in and get a software update, which changes all of those messages we've been given and are continually given every single day.
Well, it's true. I mean, you know, I have clients here in New York who exercise 3 times a day.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's, you know, and I've talked to them sometimes about how that's a little bit of a form of, it's a little bit of a bulimia thing. It is. And I'm like, because they're basically using it as, oh, then like I can eat whatever I want here because I went to Soul Cycle and did my strength training workout and did my Pilates.
Yeah. It's like a milder form of anorexia, isn't it, in some ways?
Oh, it is. That's what I always, so, you know, my best friend, my first college roommate, and I are still connected, and she was very much bulimic. And so she would actually, you know, binge purge, and I would binge and exercise simply because the other kind of purging I don't like to do. Like it just was like, that was like non-negotiable. So I was like, all right, I got to figure out a way, right, to get the stuff out of me in a way that does not involve vomit. Okay. Because I'm not going to do that. So I took it to exercise. Or if I had a big binge, then I just wouldn't eat for a couple of days. And that would be, you know, that would be my purge, and maybe over exercise a little bit in that as well. And, you know, that kind of worked, I guess, for a little while. But again, it all, you know, all of that kind of restriction and back and forth and bouncing at the end of the day does not help.
No, and, you know, it's not just about what's going on for us. It's also about how we try to hide that from people around us, or if they notice it. And, you know, that those interactions that we've had, you know, I'm working with a client at the moment. I did some work with her many years ago when she was she was 15 at the time, and she was struggling with being overweight and what that meant for her then. We've then reconnected 4 years later, and in those 4 years, she's had bulimia, anorexia, and she's now coming out of out the other side of that. So it's been a really, really difficult sort of 5 years for her. And thankfully, we've got that relationship that she wants to pick up now. She's a bit older. She understands herself a little bit more. But, you know, we were talking about, obviously, the teasing that she got because she was overweight, the pressure from her parents, you know, drove a lot of the anorexia. She had a stepmom that was anorexic as well, that kind of almost encouraged her to be anorexic. So there was a lot of things going on in her family growing up that were going to push her that way. And then, of course, she loved eating. So she learned very quickly that if she ate and was sick, that was a way of her being able to control her weight. But the biggest thing was the adoration she got for being slimmer. And this is the thing, isn't it? You know, we only have to look at before and after pictures to see how much we praise the thinner body and indirectly shame the fatter body. And so, you know, she's really impressionable. You know, you've got this 17-year-old, 18-year-old that's lost a lot of weight, that boys are now finding her attractive. That's really hard to not take on board that belief that thinner is better, you know, because evidence suggests that, because society only, very much accepts and leads us to believe that slimmer is better. I prayed at that altar for nearly 30 years, believing that, slimmer was made me more attractive, made me more lovable, made me more employable, all of that stuff. And as I said, it was only when I went into therapy and I really started to understand that. But, Al, it's so difficult to let go of those powerful messages that are being sent to us through the media. It really is. And that's what's difficult. When you start to, it's like a big rucksack, isn't it? And when we start to think about letting go of it, the thought of unsubscribing from diet culture feels so wonderful, but it really is not that simple, because it is around us and it's through us. It's, cut me open and that diet culture runs through me, and I've done so much work, and I continue to do so much work every single day in recognizing those ingrained ways I talk to myself. I used to look at myself naked in the mirror to motivate me not to eat. I mean, that's abuse. That is abuse. And I've abused my body. I have abused myself, the way I talk to myself, all in the aid of trying to be slim, and have spent most of my life overweight, interestingly. So the two don't work, do they?
Right, right. And we are obvious examples of them not working. So Hayley, where can people best get in touch with you if they want to do some work with you or find out more?
Absolutely. I go under the name of the food therapist. Interestingly, I rarely talk about food, but I run a program called If Diets Don't Work, What Does? I have a Facebook group, which, Lynda, if you're kind enough, it'd be lovely if you could promote that group. Something I've got running next week, if anyone's interested. I'm running it's a freebie. It's a 7-day trust. You're building trust with food. And a lot of what we talked about today, I'll be talking about the impact of diet culture. There'll be little experiments to try around looking at how we currently recognize hunger and how we recognize fullness cues. There will also be some exploration around, I've just been writing it all today and my mind's gone blank, but it's a real opportunity over 7 days to really start looking at your current food relationship, how diet culture stops us trusting ourselves around food and creates self-doubt, and then looking at some little experiments that will help you to start building trust around food. So that's something I've got going on. If people come over to the group, then I'm talking about the program in the group, and they'll have a link to join that.
Okay, great. So Hayley,
thank you. And do you know what? I think we could talk about this for days. Maybe we could do another and make it a bit more specific about a specific topic that your listeners might be interested in.
I think we should.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Hayley. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to the Pilates Goddess podcast. Music brought to you by Nerd Salad. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, especially if you liked it. And please like, share, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks.